Hi, welcome to the July 11th CSET webinar. Today, Kevin Chang of the College of Engineering at the University of Idaho is going to be presenting his CSET-sponsored research on school transportation safety data trends and challenges. The webinar is going to be recorded and posted on the AIDC YouTube channel within a few hours after its end. So pass it on to others if you enjoyed it. All right, and now I'll turn it over to Kevin.
All right, thank you very much, Vicki, for this opportunity. Certainly want to thank CSET to be able to share with you some results from a study that we did recently looking at school transportation safety data. And just very briefly, this is a subject that's kind of near and dear to my heart. I've been involved in this field for over 20 years now. I previously was the program manager of the school safety program for King County in the Seattle metropolitan area, where we worked with over 16 school districts and 70 schools. And then I've had the fortune, while with the University of Idaho for now almost the last 10 years, to continue exploring and examining not only school safety needs, but also school data, because it's a topic that is, I think, very impactful to communities. And I've got a couple slides here that I'll talk about in a second that I think illustrate the importance of school transportation. And I think it's a topic that oftentimes we take for granted in the way that our young boys and girls get to school. So with that, let me go ahead and just provide a very brief overview of how this presentation is going to be laid out. I'll share just a couple of slides providing a little bit of background about this topic, share with you the specific methods that we used to analyze the data, go over the results and analysis, and then share about 5 bullet points on the main conclusions of this study. So as I mentioned before, there are a lot of folks throughout the country that are likely impacted. And if you're someone in the audience who has a son or daughter who has to find their way from home to school each day, I'm sure this topic will resonate with you. The National Center for Education Statistics notes that throughout the United States, there are over 57 million students that attend either a public school or a private school. Now, when we're talking about students here, we're describing generally the kindergarten through grade 12 demographic, but 57 million students. And those of you that participate in the drill during the school year recognize there is congestion around schools, and it typically occurs during 2 points during the day. One being the morning drop-off period, and secondly, during the afternoon pickup. During the afternoon pickup, the congestion tends to be a little bit more compressed, just because kids want to leave school and get out of there as quickly as they can. Whereas in the morning, typically the period of drop-off tends to be a little bit more expanded. Children these days, there are many different options that they will utilize to get to and from school. Certainly, the non-motorized modes of walking and bicycling are popular if it is feasible and safe for them to use those modes. Of course, riding a car with mom and dad, perhaps it's a carpool that they're sharing with some friends. Those students that are further away from the school will likely be taking either yellow school bus or transit bus. And then there are other modes that children use these days: skateboard, scooter, there may be hoverboard we can throw into the mix as well. And I'll share very briefly. You'll see there in the bottom right corner of the slide, this is, I think, the type of behavior that we would like to see at almost every school. Not only are our children and their parents walking or biking to school, but it seems to be a relatively safe environment. You can see that there's quite a few children. Can be part of a walking school bus of sorts. We've got a crossing guard. This looks to be either a teacher or parent that is providing safe passage across what appears to be a relatively busy street, an arterial multi-lane, two-way left turn lane down the middle. And I share this photo because this really is what we consider to be an ideal setting. This was a photo that was staged. It was taken when I was with King County and was used for some of our school safety brochures. In reality, we know that this is not always the case, that it's a mixed bag of students and parents, sometimes maybe a young boy or girl traveling by themselves. And a lot of times parents will be somewhat reluctant to allow their young son or daughter to be crossing a busy arterial that may have pretty high traffic volumes or traffic speeds. And so this is a desire, but oftentimes is not the case in the real world. The last bullet item is one that I do want to spend a little bit of time just talking about. And it's the recognition that when you're able to have school children, particularly walk or bike to school, it does lend itself to lifelong habit-forming behavior. A lot of times these days we talk about that, the health and welfare of adults. If we could get them moving more, walking more, certainly that was exacerbated by the pandemic in finding outlets and venues for people to get a little bit of physical activity. And I think it's important to recognize that, to get people to think about walking or biking, it's much more beneficial if they've already developed some sort of habit as a young child. And there have been a number of studies that have been done examining the declining number of students who are walking and biking. It used to be in the late 60s and 70s, nearly half of students had that opportunity. And that has declined into the teens here recently. And so, it's challenging if you're talking to adults today to say, hey, you really should be walking more. You should be getting your 10,000 steps a day. And they've never, ever experienced that as a child. You're going to be running into a lot more pushback than if you talk to the same adult who maybe had 8 to 10 years of walking and biking when they were a child. And so there's an important, I think, underlying factor, that if you can get boys and girls to be walking and biking at an early age, that can lend itself to some positive outcomes later in life. Now, in terms of literature, there are resources that are available, and I point to one that probably is the closest to the one that we looked at for our study. This is a NHTSA report that comes out every year. NHTSA, of course, standing for the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They do produce a report, and it focuses on school transportation-related crashes. Now, there's a caveat with their report, and I just kind of want to highlight it, and it's there in the middle paragraph, which, if it's difficult for you to read, let me read it off of my screen here. It says, in terms of the school transportation related crashes that are identified as part of this traffic safety facts report, it defines a school transportation related crash as a motor vehicle traffic crash that directly or indirectly involves a school transportation vehicle. These include a vehicle of a school bus body type or of a non-school bus vehicle functioning as a school bus, transporting children to or from school or school-related activities. For the purposes of this fact sheet, school-age children are defined as 18 or younger. Although ages 5 to 18 are typically considered school age, the data shows that some transportation fatalities, of course, occur under the age of 5. And so if I can simplify this a little bit, what it's saying is it uses FARS data, which is the Fatality Analysis Reporting System data, but it is linked to a school transportation vehicle. So as we're going to talk about here in just a second, obviously, if we're looking at school transportation, there are many, many other modes that may be utilized as part of that trip. And so that's what our study intended to do, was kind of broaden this out a little bit and see if our results are somewhat different. And again, you can access this online just by doing a search of traffic safety facts, NHTSA, school transportation. I will mention the first bullet item is one that we'll be comparing our results to. It states that from 2010 to 2019, there were 1,080 school transportation related crashes, and 1,199 people of all ages were killed in those crashes, an average of about 120 fatalities per year. So just kind of file that factoid away, and we'll be coming back to that here in a little bit. So wanted to share a little bit of discussion with regard to the data collection process. I'm based in the state of Idaho, so I pulled up the Idaho Vehicle Collision Report. And invariably, one of the challenges associated with school transportation data, and this is true for all various types of trip purposes, is that in the event of a collision or crash, a lot of times the reason, in fact, most of the time, the reason for the trip is not something that is collected. Certainly, if you're a citizen involved in a crash, or in this case, law enforcement, they're concerned about collecting data about the type of vehicle, the roadway conditions. You can see here, making sure you've got all the driver information, light conditions, weather, that type of information. And if you look through this form, there's really very limited information that is related to schools. Now, I didn't highlight it on this slide, but you'll see here under traffic control, there are a couple choices. We've got school zone, and we've also got school bus signal. And so let me see if I can use my, I think I can use maybe my laser pointer here. You can see we've got school zone designated and school bus signal. So if it falls within that within that type of location, it may be recorded. Now, if you've ever filled out one of these collision forms, you know that there's an awful lot of location, a lot of information, and sometimes even if it occurred in a school zone, this information may not necessarily be filled in, and it's sort of the nature of the beast. So if we go to the next slide, sort of the second form, we see that here again, a lot of information about the driver and the pedestrian, and the school bus, of course, is noted as a vehicle that was involved in the collision. And so I think that in and of itself lends itself to why in NHTSA, when it reports school transportation data, highlights the transport mode, the transport vehicle of school bus, because that makes the data analysis process a little bit easier, given the fact that there are so many collisions that occur throughout the United States each year. Now, the process, the methods that we used for our study, and I'm going to dive into the weeds here just a little bit, because I think it is important to share the specific steps that we use to not only gather the data, but analyze the data, is we did use FARS as well. And we went through 20 years of data. So we looked at data from 2000 through the calendar year 2019, and went through essentially all of the data files that are available. So this was a very extensive data process. And these next couple of slides, I'm going to walk through, and again, in somewhat detailed nature, the process that we went through to capture all of the potential school transportation related crashes. So bear with me as we go through what are going to be 6 tables in total. The first data file that we looked at was the accident data file. And so this captures essentially the accidents that occurred. And you can see that there are a couple of specific categories within the accident file that we paid particular close attention to. And those are listed in the column that's labeled SAS name. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time here sort of reading some of the descriptions that FARS provided. So first category, the SCH_bus category is a school bus related category. It essentially was a data element that identified if a school bus or motor vehicle functioning as a school bus was related to the crash. And so if that category was listed as yes, we pulled that crash file for our analysis. The next line item, CF1, CF2, CF3, these are related factors associated with the crash level, records factors that are related to the crash expressed in the case materials. And in particular, if there was the code that identified a crash occurring within a designated school zone, we made sure to note it. And then the third category in the accident data file, TRA_CONT, this represents traffic control device, identifies the attribute that best describes the traffic controls in the vehicle's environment just prior to the vehicle's critical pre-crash events based on the case material. And based on case materials. And there were a couple of codes that were pertinent to school transportation, the attribute code 30 for school speed limit sign, 31, as you can see, for school advance or crossing sign, 38 for other school-related sign, and then 39 for unknown type of school zone sign. So as we went through this data file, if any of these attribute codes were listed as part of a particular crash, we made sure to note it. And again, we did this for 20 years in total. Second table is a little bit more extensive. This is the vehicle data file. And essentially is a data file that captures information about the in-transport motor vehicle. Number of different categories. Again, I'll try and go through these relatively quickly. We have BODY_TYP. This is actually a school bus related category, identifies a classification of this vehicle based on the general body configuration, size, shape, and doors. And we have two, code 24 for a van-based school bus and 50 if it was identified as a school bus. The next category, BUS_USE or bus use, describes the common type of bus service that this vehicle was being used as at the time of the crash, or the primary use for the bus if not in service at the time of the crash. So invariably, one of the challenges is it could have been a school bus that was involved in a crash, but maybe the driver was leaving the school. And so there were no children present on the bus itself. That still would have gotten linked into this particular crash record. Next item is SPEC_USE or special use. Here again, you may have had a school bus or vehicle used for school transport, and so it would have been included in this category. We've got a number of SAS names that start with a DR and end in either CF and some number or SF and some number. You can see here the description is relatively long. These are records with factors related to the driver expressed in the case materials. And you can see that for attribute code 33 in particular, if there was a crash that occurred where, and we've got a number of different categories, but they're all lumped into this category attribute code 33. Passing were prohibited, where passing was prohibited with posted signs, where there was some issue with pavement markings, presence of a hill or curve, or a school bus displaying warning not to pass. All of that would have been lumped into attribute code 33. And I'll talk a little bit about why that proves to be a little bit of a challenge when we're analyzing our data. The next category is VTRAFCON, or one for traffic control device. This identifies the attribute that best describes the traffic controls in the vehicle's environment just prior to this vehicle's critical pre-crash event. And then the last one, starting with VIOLCHG here, these are the violations that are charged. This data element identifies violations charged to the driver in the crash. And you can see under speed-related offenses, we've got a couple, one where there was some sort of special speed limit, potentially in a school zone, and the other recognizing a driver that passed a stopped school bus. So these, again, were all codes that were part of the vehicle data file. And I should point out that, in some cases, there might have been a crash that was listed in the vehicle data file, but it was not included in the accident data file. So ultimately, we had to collect and combine the crashes, the pertinent crashes from each of the data files, and then consolidate them together to identify all of the possible crashes that were related to school transportation. Couple more here. The third table at the very top there relates to a person data file. This includes both motorists and non-motorists. And you can see that, again, we've got in the person data file attribute code 33, very similar to before, records factors related to motor vehicle occupants other than drivers and persons not in motor vehicles as expressed in the case materials. So now, again, we're looking at situation where it may have been passing were prohibited by posted signs, pavement markings, hill or curve, or the school bus displaying a warning not to pass. And again, this was part of the person data file. Last three data files, the first one is labeled as PB type. This refers to people that were categorized as pedestrians or bicyclists, hence the PB acronym, or people on personal conveyances. And here there were a couple. PBS ZONE represents a school zone. So if the crash occurred in a school zone, that would have been identified with a attribute code 1. And then PEDCTYPE is a crash type involving a pedestrian. And here, this data element summarizes the circumstances of the crash for this pedestrian. And if it was somehow related to a school bus stop, it would have been given an attribute code of 342. And then the final two data files, the first violation. So if there was a violation noted and the violation charge, here we have a couple of attribute codes, 24 for exceeding the special speed limit. Again, including excessive speed in a school zone, but it could have been for some other factors. And then attribute code 55, again, for a situation where the pass occurred at a stopped school bus. And then the very last table, not NMPRIOR, the NM standing for non-motorist. You can see that we have a code describing the actions of the non-motorist immediately prior to the involvement in the crash. And this one is, I think, probably of all the codes that I described, the one the most pertinent to our study. It was specifically for, again, non-motorists that were going to or from school. And we're talking about non-motorists representing the kindergarten through grade 12 demographic. So had to take all the data and see what kind of results we would have. And so again, within the FARS database, you've got a number of different data files. And so we found ourselves having to pull from each of these 6 data files to complete our analysis. Now, the other caveat with school travel, and I've put in block letters here that it is subjective, is we had to put some additional parameters in play. So you imagine now we've got this database. We've taken all of the school transportation related crashes from FARS. We've got this 20-year history. The next step is to recognize that school travel is only going to occur during certain times of the year and during certain times of the week, as well as certain times of the day. And so ultimately we ended up prescribing a couple of specific parameters. And I put the word subjective because it in fact is subjective. There's going to be different times for different schools, and ultimately we wanted to capture as many as possible. So for this study, what we ended up doing was we screened out certain crashes. So if a crash occurred on a Saturday or Sunday, we did not include it. Now, again, I recognize that there certainly are going to be school events that occur on a weekend. Perhaps it's a school that's competing in a tournament or invitational out of town, and it happens to occur on a Saturday. But again, we try to collect the main, sort of the most common times. So only school travel that occurred on Monday through Friday was included. Now, the morning arrival window and afternoon dismissal window, again, going to vary from location to location. And ultimately, the window that we chose to analyze for morning arrivals, somewhat broad, I contend, was from 6 o'clock in the morning to just before 9 o'clock. And again, 6 o'clock may seem a little bit early, but there are certainly school districts that may need to cover a very large geographic area. There may be students that are attending a before class or 0 period course. And so we wanted to try to capture some of those elements. So for morning arrival window, 6 a.m. to 8:59 a.m. was the window that we used. Afternoon dismissal, again, subject to the location that you live in. The window that we used for this study was from 2 o'clock in the afternoon to just before 5 o'clock in the evening. And then we recognize that generally speaking, the school year is not going to be occurring during the summer. And so we chose the dates from September 1st through June 15th. Again, on the periphery, there may be school districts that start a little bit before that window. There may be some schools that end up having to end a little bit after, but looking at this from a national level, we felt like that the September 1st to June 15th window would be most appropriate. And then lastly, we also wanted to take a look and see if there would be different outcomes depending on whether the crash occurred in a rural environment or an urban environment. And for this designation, we again used coding that FARS has already identified. And so you can see that it was primarily based on the roadway function code. This code was present for the 2000 through 2014 data set. And then in 2015, they actually changed the data element and simply had a rural or urban coding. And so that's what we then used after starting in 2015. So to compare rural versus urban, these were the category codes that we used. So taking all that information, now let's get to what's probably the most interesting component of this presentation, and those are the results. And so we looked at results from three different angles. The first is the persons category. And so let me orient you to the slide. What you're seeing here is on the x-axis, of course, is the calendar year. Along the y-axis for this first graphic are the number of people that were involved in the crash. And we've got two different data sets. The solid blue line represents crashes in rural areas or designated on a rural facility. The orange dotted line is for urban facilities. And so you can see the trend. I'll talk about trend lines here in just a second, but just sort of broadly from a descriptive standpoint, you can see that starting in 2000, the number of people that were involved in these crashes tended to be higher, particularly on our rural facilities, compared to the far right side of this graphic in 2017, 18, and in particular in 2019, which was almost a low point. So rural, the number of people involved in a school transportation related crash, again, based on the parameters that we've identified, did trend down for rural facilities. Less conclusive for urban facilities. You can see it's followed a relatively narrow band between about 150 people and 250 people over the 20 years. And so these were our initial results for people. I have two other slides that show that will look very similar. The second deals with school buses in particular. And so you can see here again, two lines, one for rural and one for urban. Again, I think if we were to generalize this, the line for rural has been trending downward, hit a peak of just over 60 school buses in 2008. And then our low point was in 2014, just under 30 school buses. And again, the band for for school buses that were involved in a fatal crash on our rural facilities has again remained in a relatively tight band between 30 and 50 school buses each year. And then the last category, arguably the one that is of most importance, is the number of lives that are lost. Certainly when a student or someone that's involved in a school-related crash loses their life, we usually hear about it. The news is very cognizant of fatalities involving school buses or school children. And so you can see based on our analysis that the number of fatalities that have occurred on rural facilities, again, has generally speaking appears to be trending downward, hit a peak of just almost 120 people in 2000. There was a little bit of an uptick in 2008, and then dropped down to just over 40 in 2014. Whereas for our urban facilities has remained relatively tight band from 2000 to 2015. And then there appears to be a slight uptick with our high point occurring in 2016, where there were just over 80 fatalities. And now, if you look at this data set, recall back to the NHTSA handout that we had earlier. So if we're looking at fatalities based on our analysis, our numbers, of course, are just a little bit higher because we've got to add the rural data set and urban data set together. And you can see that we're roughly, just about maybe 130, 140, 150 fatalities occurring each year based on the data set that we used. So that those numbers are somewhat higher than the report that NHTSA produced. Now, one last slide here on the results. And what we did was we took the data sets and then we did do a regression analysis looking at trends. And so I did want to share that. Ultimately, what we found was, regardless of whether it was a rural set or urban set, the trends are heading in a favorable direction. All of the coefficient values, if you will, for the regression lines are negative, with the exception of the fatalities that occurred in urban areas. That one is slightly positive. But we're seeing trends where, depending on the element that you're looking at, about 0.5% up to 2.5% of a decline each year. And so that's a good outcome, that we're heading in the right direction. I think it's also worth mentioning that these are of course raw numbers, the actual number of people, actual number of school buses, actual number of fatalities. And we know that since 2000, there have been certainly more vehicles that have been traveling on our roadways. And so if we were to look at this from a rate standpoint, we know that the numbers are even more favorable than what I'm sharing with you here. So, generally speaking, we're heading in the right direction, but there's still work to be done. Each of these graphics, if I go back one real quick, I was intentional in making sure to label the y-axis starting from 0. I think, with all of the programs that are out there right now, Vision Zero as an example, we would like to see the number of fatalities be at that very, very low number. And so we still do have, we have room, we have space to go before we reach that threshold. Here, this trend line shows the number of people involved in a rural area as an example. And you can see, for us to get to 0, we're looking at a couple more decades before we would reach that magical point. So in terms of conclusions, I think the main takeaways here are, from a very big picture standpoint, school transportation remains a relatively safe travel activity. Again, imagining the tens of millions of students that travel. We're fortunate, knock on wood, to have a relatively low number of fatalities that occur each year. Now, that being said, it's still a non-zero value, so there is room for growth. As I mentioned before, the trends, as we look at it over a 20-year horizon, are trending in the right direction, so they are favorable. The challenge with this study, and I think I've kind of hinted at it, is in order to provide good information, you need good data. And there are some limitations to this data. As I mentioned before earlier, some of those categories that looked at factors, for example, as an example, the code that we used, code 33, for example, we included the code as part of our analysis because it includes crashes that occur where you have a school bus displaying a warning not to pass. But that code also includes other factors. So if there was a driver that was passing when they shouldn't have, and there was either signage or markings that were present, that code would have also absorbed some of those crashes as well. And in all likelihood, those crashes were non-school related. And so we've got a little bit too much data. And of course, if we're relying solely on the FARS data, it's not entirely clear what the particular crash was. In other words, whether it was school related or not. And so there's still opportunities to fine tune. I share with you this photo on the right because I think it's a good sort of visual in terms of where improvements could be made. So I took this photo in the Phoenix metro area a couple years back. So it gets the message across, I think, to drivers that there's a school crosswalk location present, but there's two issues that are inappropriate or no longer MUTCD compliant. The first, of course, is that the school silhouette no longer uses the parallel lines. And so that sign is out of date. And of course, it should be a diagonal pointing arrow to illustrate to identify to the driver where that crosswalk is. In this case, it looks like the local public agency just took a horizontal arrow and kind of tweaked it to help illustrate that point. So it's not perfect. It gets the message across, but certainly it should be improved to meet code. And so that's my analogy for talking about how there needs to be improvements to the data. Another limitation to the FARS data, of course, it focuses on fatalities. So if there are injuries that are present, near misses, those of course would not be accounted for in this data set. And lastly, I think it's important to recognize that when we're dealing with crash records, there may be opportunities. There in fact are opportunities to refine the crash record process. Now, this is a huge animal. Getting a state agency to change and update those crash records is never an easy task. And certainly, I think if one were to get into a room and focus on the discussion as to how the crash records should be improved, identifying school transportation as a topic that needs to be addressed probably wouldn't be a high point of that discussion. But certainly, if we are to look at school transportation at a much finer level, the data needs to be, there needs to be better data available in order for us to assess that. And so with that, that is my last slide, an aerial view of the Moscow community. We're seeing a shift in the Palouse region from wheat to, as you can see in the background there, a lot of shades of yellow. That's canola that a lot of our farmers are planting these days. But that's just a quick snapshot into what we're seeing these days here in the Moscow and University of Idaho community. So with that, I'm certainly eager and open to answer questions. I see one that has popped up in the chat pod, so let me go ahead and grab that. Anna, thank you for asking. Question is funding opportunities for schools to pay for traffic school crossing guards. My neighborhood school can't seem to fill the position, and I think that's a broader concern. Boy, that's always a challenge. I think when it comes to funding, the resources have and always continue to be very, very limited. I'm trying to think of if there are any opportunities off the top of my head, and I'm kind of drawing a blank. I know that, at the state level, sometimes there are programs that are available that will address school safety. I know that many years ago, the Washington Traffic Safety Commission was able to find funding for the flashing school beacons. They recognized that was a tool that could be used to essentially draw attention to drivers that they were traveling through a school zone. And the Traffic Commission provided the hardware for school districts to purchase a couple of those devices, and that was very, very popular. But in terms of school crossing guards, I'm not aware of any funding opportunities that are available at this point. I think the other challenge is, you may be able to find, there may be some financial resources. If you were to get them, the challenge then becomes who is your crossing guard, and the staffing has been a challenge in terms of schools finding teachers who may be willing to volunteer their time, or parents, and I know that that has not been easy as well. So it's a great question. I unfortunately don't have a good answer for you on that front. Perhaps someone from the local PTA may be willing to step in and help out. It ultimately, a lot of times, becomes a very grassroots issue. Are there any other questions? Like I said, school transportation it's such an important issue. We encourage, I've got a couple of little ones, and we live very close to our elementary school. And I think I would be very comfortable in having our two daughters, make that short walk to school. They have to cross one road that's not even an arterial, and it's always staffed, with an older adult. And I just would have, no hesitation. And yet, even in my own family, my wife is very reluctant. She would be much more inclined to put them in a car, drive them to the front door, let them off, and then do that in the afternoon. And so, there are issues of that sort that are challenging. But again, I think it's important. And of course, when she makes that trip in the morning and afternoon, she's contributing to the congestion issue that I alluded to. Whereas if I or she accompanied our daughters to school on by walking or biking, not only are we cutting down on the congestion, we're also, I think, limiting our ability to contribute to a potential crash. But they're all, each family, I think, deals with those kinds of issues, and it's it's challenging. The one thing I didn't mention in this presentation, and let me just take a second to include as well, is in communities that are experiencing a lot of growth, particularly residential developments, suburban developments. There's going to be a need for a new elementary school or middle school at some point in the future. And of course, the way that land prices work, after that development has been built out, the local school district likely is going to need to find a parcel that is on the periphery of that community, because they're not going to be able to find a parcel that is either big enough or priced at a point that they can afford. And so that in and of itself lends to even more transportation challenges, because in those situations, it just may not be practical for the child to walk or bike to the school. It's not going to be a neighborhood school. It's going to be a school that may be, a mile or two away. And more often than not, those schools are located on a busy arterial. So we're just, even before the school is built, we're creating some challenges, transportation challenges. So in any case, I could go on and on, but I appreciate everyone's participation today. Happy to answer any questions offline. If you think of anything, please feel free to reach me after this webinar is over, and I'm happy to do that to the best of my abilities. So with that, thank you very much, Vicki. I'll turn the floor over back over to you. Thank you again.
Well, actually, I had a question for you, Kevin.
Okay,
Did you
please.
ever look at any data based on the age of the driver? I mean, because high school students are quite frequently driving themselves to school.
Yeah,
And
that's
so
a
I
great
wondered
question.
if they're
Yeah,
higher risk.
there are there's a lot of different ways that we can parse this data even further. And so that's sort of a logical next step, is to look at I think time of day, as I mentioned before, our windows are 3-hour blocks. We can certainly look at them in terms of, all right, maybe 6 o'clock was too early of a start. What are the trends? 6 to 7, 7 to 8, 8 to 9. To answer your question, the age of the drivers, we've got this somewhat more consolidated data set looking at the age of the drivers to see if we've got a lot of 16 and 17-year-olds that were contributors to fatal crashes. Were they boys? Were they girls? So a lot of more ways to slice and dice this data, but we didn't look at those sort of more fine-grained elements when we reported the results for this study. So to be continued, I think is probably the best answer I can give you.
All right, well, thank you for that. If there aren't any more questions, I will stop the recording, and thank you, Kevin, for a wonderful presentation.
All right, thank you everyone very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.